Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. So today we're again starting near and around Bakhmut. As I have reported yesterday, the noose is tightening around Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians are claiming that they still have the ability to withdraw from Bakhmut, but I would say that is very speculative at this point, given the collapse of the eastern defense line of Ukrainian forces. And I want to zoom in here where you, the viewer, can see exactly what I'm talking about. And again, we are using a pro-Ukrainian resource. This map is developed and produced by Ukrainian supporters. It is accurate, and for the most part, it does tend to obviously gravitate towards the Ukrainian side, but nonetheless, it's probably the best map out there that I can use for the channel to talk about the conflict. So if you look at the main Ukrainian defense line, or where it originally was, it ran along this small river, due just to the east of the city. And if we look at what happened, if we look at the initial advance of Russian forces, the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops behind this defensive barrier that protected the Ukrainian forces in terms of Russian forces simply just manhandling their way into the center of Bakhmut, they did have this terrain feature. Now, I believe the Ukrainians were more worried about what would happen in the north and the south, and continued to put up robust defenses and provide a multitude of brigades and combat battalions for the defense of Bakhmut being encircled entirely. But if you look at now what has happened in the east, the Russians have effectively pushed the Ukrainians into the center of the city, and we'll back the time up a few days and kind of let you see what for yourself has happened. So if we go prior back to March 14th, you can see essentially the Ukrainians had a fairly good line that ran just to the east of the city. Now the Russians were making inroads to the south and to a lesser extent to the north as well. But as the Russians have continued to call in air support, artillery fire against Ukrainian forces on these very, very precise strikes running along the line of contact in this last defensive line that the Ukrainians have created, there's probably another defensive belt or line in this area as well. Again, as I've talked about before, they're using every building. And these are old Soviet-style buildings made of concrete and what have you. So they're fairly effective at resisting some heavy weapons fire. But if we move from March 14th to the present day, I'm going backwards here, and let's go forward. You'll see what has happened here. And again, it starts from the south. And again, they're continuing to house by house, street by street, taking areas from the Ukrainians. And then on the 24th, it looks like the Russians make a fairly significant push to cross the river and enter the center of Bakhmut. And so now March 24th to March 25th, 26th, March 26th, March 27th, 28th, 27th to the 28th, the Russians cross the river on the eastern quadrant of Bakhmut. And we go to the 29th, the 30th, again from north to south. And this is where April 2nd, where they really get in, the Russians get into what could be called the center of the city. And then finally, even more so. More blocks have been taken. The main street into the city is this street right here. The name escapes me, but again, you can clearly see they're just pushing into Bakhmut. And then finally, the fourth, the entire eastern section, east center section of Bakhmut is taken by Russian forces. And I've talked about the difficulty. Now, all these Ukrainian forces are now compacted in this very tight area. And it's difficult for the Ukrainian forces to withdraw over these open fields at a risk of being attacked by Russian aircraft and Russian heavy artillery. And that's kind of where we sit today. So things are not good in Bakhmut for Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians, talk that they continue to hold Bakhmut. Yes, they do have forces in Bakhmut in the western portions of the city. You can see the main railway runs through the city as well, and the Russians are very, very close to that area. And then finally, we'll have to see if the Ukrainians, what kind of fight they decide to put up in the western portions. The western portions, again, are also these old Soviet apartment blocks. These are all mainly single-family dwellings, but all this area, these are the I guess you could call it the government quarter for the Bakhmut city area. But all this has been taken by Russian forces, and now the fighting is taking place to the west of the call it the government quarter or the civil infrastructure quarter of Bakhmut due to the east. But again, you can clearly see they were able to push to the east, cross the river, and push into central Bakhmut. And remember, initially we were thinking that, well, in all probability, the Russians are going to try to push from the north into the south, completely encircle. But they're not doing that. They're able to push from the east and move to the east to west against these Ukrainian forces. And again, it's not looking, just from a tactical viewpoint of the map, it's not looking good for Ukrainian forces. And if we go over to the deployment map, you can see, obviously, this has been slightly updated. They did not, at least this map did not take into account this area now being controlled by the Russians. But again, you have the 93rd Brigade of Ukrainian forces. You have territorial units, the 241st Territorial Brigade. You have the 3rd Operational Spartan Brigade of the National Guard. We understand quite a few of these National Guard brigades that are turning into assault brigades are actually training someplace in western Ukraine. There's about 8 brigades that are of the Ukrainian National Guard that are being turned into what they call assault brigades. These are 5,000 man brigades that are designed for offensive operation by the Ukrainian National Guard, not the Ukrainian Army or ground forces, but the Ukrainian National Guard. And then finally, you have Special Operations Forces, the 8th Regiment of Special Purpose. That's Ukrainian Special Forces. Again, 10th Special Forces Detachment, and this unit here, the 77th Air Mobile Brigade as well. So quite a few Ukrainian forces still fighting for Bakhmut. I would say that the Ukrainians are going to try to get these higher-end forces out of the city first, and unfortunately, the forces that are going to remain in the city and probably be enveloped and then destroyed by Russian forces is going to be the 93rd Mechanized Brigade and these territorial forces. The 241st Territorial Defense Force as well is in jeopardy of being enveloped and then destroyed by Russian forces. So not a good predicament for Ukrainian forces as the Russians continue this pressure campaign near Bakhmut. And yes, as I've said before, the Russians could bring in just massive amounts of firepower and utterly level the city. They haven't done that yet. Yes, the city has been hit. The city has been largely destroyed. But it hasn't been rubbleized yet. The Russians haven't focused enough firepower to just obliterate everything inside the city. And they could do that with thermal barrack munitions and just the size and scope of the capabilities that the Russians have in terms of artillery and air power as well. And we're just not seeing that take place. So the Russians are trying to take this at least in as best shape as possible, and it looks like they're trying to spare the 5,000 or so Russian supporters that live in the city. And there are Russian supporters that live in the city. If we go to the south near Avdiivka, we have reports that the Ukrainians have mounted a counterattack, possibly a reconnaissance in force. It doesn't look like it fared very well. It was to the north of Avdiivka, possibly around the salient here that has been created by Russian forces. And we believe that it was elements of the 110th Mechanized Brigade, possibly being supported by elements of the 53rd Mechanized Brigade, which is the primary defense unit inside of Avdiivka. So it looks like they went after the salient here with this brigade, possibly other elements, maybe naval infantry support, maybe even territorial defense units were involved in the operation. But holding this area down for the Russians. Opposite is the 114th Motorized Rifle Brigade, and it looks like another battalion tactical group of Russian formation. Quite possibly more. They're just not noted here on the map. A lot of Russian units simply are unknown in terms of where they're located, and it's just kind of a best guess at this point. But again, as we have reported earlier about the National Guard of the Ukrainians, again, about 8 brigades are being trained, and we're seeing a fairly large expansion of the Ukrainian National Guard. So you have the Ukrainian Regular Army, in the parallel to the Ukrainian Army or ground forces. You have another force, which is the Ukrainian National Guard. It is not like the United States National Guard, where they're part-time forces. These are full-time. They were mainly for used as riot police, internal security, regime protection forces, just a parallel force to the regular army. And that force, at the onset of hostilities, numbered between 60 and 90,000, and we think this force is now well over 100,000, meaning the Ukrainian National Guard. And now they're creating these assault brigades. At least 8 of these brigades are being formed up. Again, 5,000 men in each of these National Guard brigades. And then some of these National Guard brigades now are the size of divisions. They're greatly expanding, upwards to 8, sometimes 9 battalions in some of these Ukrainian National Guard units, as is the regular Ukrainian ground forces, as it continues to expand. It probably numbers close to 700,000 personnel, if not more. The Ukrainian Armed Forces as a whole probably number well over or close to just over a million personnel. As far as Russian expansion, we continue to see it. We don't have firm numbers. We think the Russian ground forces component has probably expanded in the realm of about 800,000 persons. 800,000 troops in the regular Russian ground forces. Obviously, that was at the onset of hostilities. The ground forces of the Russian Federation numbered about 300,000. Then you have the airborne forces. That has probably expanded upwards to 60. Some say up to 80,000 personnel. But again, it's very difficult to get firm numbers, especially for the VDV or the Russian airborne forces. Then you have the expanding Russian naval infantry forces as well. That force was about 35,000. And then you have the Russian National Guard. The Russians have their own National Guard. Again, not like the United States National Guard, where they're part-time service personnel. These are full-time security forces that exist, and that force has probably expanded as well, numbering around 300,000. If you remember, they were the old Soviet internal troops that have became the National Guard. We have seen other forces, other security elements within the Russian Federation also be attached to the National Guard, such as their federal riot police and their version of SWAT units or SWAT teams, or regional SWAT forces, which are much bigger than what you would see here in the United States. But again, that is where we're at for today. We're going to continue to watch what is near Seversk. We do think Seversk, east, north, and south of Seversk, is going to be an area of significant contention here in the near future. When summer arrives, again, you have areas that are very marshy in this area. And a lot of this is going to dry up. And right now, it's just not conducive to offensive operations given the high water table that exists in eastern Ukraine and all the mud. But we're going to watch this area very closely because we believe the next hot spot is going to be this area near Seversk for both parties involved. And we'll continue to watch what is happening in Bakhmut as well. Again, it is becoming endgame for Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. It's just going to be very difficult for these Ukrainian forces to continue to hold out against the size and scope of Russian forces that have been deployed in this area. So that's it for today. We'll have more very, very soon. Thank you for joining us. More to come. Have a good day.